The following scene contains sensitive images that may be disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Victorian London's East End was a maze of poverty, vice, and shadow, the perfect hunting ground. Between August and November 1888, Jack the Ripper mutilated 5 prostitutes in ways that horrified even the most hardened detectives. Scotland Yard received hundreds of letters, chased dozens of suspects, and failed spectacularly. But one piece of evidence, buried in police archives for over a century, reveals a pattern investigators missed entirely. Whitechapel existed as a world unto itself in the summer of 1888, a district where nearly 1 million souls pressed together in conditions that defied human dignity. The streets twisted like intestines through neighborhoods where entire families occupied single rooms in crumbling tenements that leaned against each other, like drunks outside the gin palaces. Coal smoke hung perpetual over the district, mixing with the stench of horse manure piled in gutters and the rotting garbage that accumulated in courtyards where children played among the refuse. Gaslight flickered weakly against the perpetual gloom, casting shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose through the narrow passages and courts. Here lived the unfortunate women, those who sold their bodies for 4pence to secure a bed in a common lodging house, who walked the streets until dawn, if they lacked even that pittance. The Metropolitan Police maintained a presence, but remained desperately undermanned for a district teeming with vice and desperation. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline knew these streets better than most, having spent 14 years working the East End. He had investigated murders born of rage and gin, had walked through blood-soaked rooms where neighbors had settled scores with knives. Yet even Aberline could not have imagined what approached. Somewhere in the maze of Whitechapel, a predator already moved with purpose toward his chosen hunting ground. The clock hands crept toward 4 in the morning on August 31st, 1888. Police Constable John Neal walked his beat along Buck's Row in the early morning darkness, his lantern cutting through the fog. At 20 minutes to 4, he noticed a shape lying in a gateway and approached expecting another drunk sleeping rough. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his days. Marianne Nichols lay on her back, her throat cut so deeply the vertebrae showed white through the gaping wound. Neal blew his whistle, and within minutes other constables arrived, along with Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn, who lived nearby. The doctor made a cursory examination by lamplight and pronounced her dead, noting the throat had been slashed twice from left to right with considerable force. Only later at the mortuary did the full horror reveal itself, when attendants discovered deep abdominal mutilations, jagged cuts that exposed the intestines. Llewellyn reported that whoever wielded the knife possessed some anatomical knowledge, given the deliberate nature of the wounds. Polly Nichols had been 42 years old, separated from her husband after years of alcoholism, drifting between workhouses and lodging houses. Her last confirmed sighting placed her at 18 Thrall Street at 1:30 in the morning, too drunk and penniless to afford her bed. She had walked back into the night, seeking 4pence. The initial police theory centered on a domestic dispute, or perhaps a client turned violent. Coroner Wynne Baxter viewed the body with a more critical eye, noting details that troubled him beyond the obvious brutality. The newspapers ran sensational accounts that generated concern among local residents, but not yet panic. When Aberline arrived at the mortuary and studied the wounds, he saw a precision that spoke not of rage, but of terrible purpose. Aberline compiled his initial suspect list with methodical care, focusing on men whose trades brought them into regular contact with blood and sharp instruments. Slaughterhouse workers from the Aldgate meat markets topped the list, alongside sailors who frequented the Whitechapel lodging houses and known violent criminals with histories of assault against women. His detectives fanned out through the district, conducting door-to-door interviews. taking witness statements from night workers and insomniacs who might have seen something in those dark hours before dawn. The name Leather Apron began circulating through the streets, a nickname for John Pizer, a local boot finisher with a reputation for intimidating prostitutes. The newspapers seized upon this figure with fervor, transforming him into a phantom of the alleys despite lack of evidence. Penny dreadfuls and illustrated papers published lurid accounts that inflamed public imagination and sold thousands of copies. The East End community turned inward with suspicion, eyeing foreigners with particular hostility, whispering about Jewish immigrants and deranged doctors conducting secret experiments. Victorian forensic science offered little help to investigators who had no means of fingerprint analysis, no blood typing to distinguish human from animal, no standardized crime scene photography to preserve evidence. The inquest into Nichols' death concluded with the frustrating verdict of willful murder by person or persons unknown. Whitechapel returned to its routine brutality, the murder becoming just another tragedy in a district thick with them. But Aberline and his men felt a persistent unease they could not shake. Something about the precision of those cuts suggested a mind at work, not merely a hand. The killer was learning, refining his technique, and somewhere in the labyrinth of streets, he moved unseen. September 8th arrived with the pale light of dawn creeping over the rooftops at 6 in the morning. John Davis descended the stairs of 29 Hanbury Street just after 6 in the morning, heading to the backyard privy as he did every day. What he found in the narrow passage between the house and fence sent him running back inside, screaming for help. Annie Chapman lay on her back against the wooden fence, her head nearly severed from her body, her skirts pulled up and her abdomen opened in a grotesque display. The killer had worked mere feet from windows where 17 people slept, in a yard accessible through an unlocked front door that anyone might have used. Dr. George Bagster Phillips arrived and conducted his examination with growing horror, noting that the throat had been severed clear to the spine and that the uterus had been removed entirely along with portions of the bladder. More disturbing still, certain organs had been arranged with deliberate care near the body. Annie Chapman had been 47 years old, separated from her husband, surviving by selling flowers and crochet work when she could, selling herself when she could not. Witnesses placed her alive at 5:30 that morning, meaning the killer had struck in increasing daylight, taking enormous risks. Phillips delivered his bombshell testimony at the inquest with clinical precision. The killer possessed anatomical knowledge, he stated flatly. No common butcher or madman could have removed those organs with such speed and accuracy. This single statement transformed the investigation as theories multiplied about medical students, disgraced doctors, butchers, veterinary surgeons. Police began watching hospitals and medical schools, staking out abattoirs, compiling lists of anyone with surgical training. Public panic spread like fever through the East End, as women refused to walk alone, and vigilante groups formed to patrol the streets. Aberline stood in the mortuary staring at the jar containing what remained of Annie Chapman, fixating on the absent uterus and asking himself the question that would haunt the investigation. Why had the killer taken it? The media frenzy around Leather Apron reached fever pitch as newspapers transformed John Pizer from a local boot finisher into the embodiment of East End evil. Anti-Semitic undertones poisoned the coverage as journalists and illustrators depicted him with exaggerated Jewish features, tapping into deep prejudices against the immigrant population that had flooded Whitechapel in recent decades. Pizer was arrested on September 10th and subjected to intensive interrogation at Leman Street Police Station, but his alibis for both murders proved solid and unshakable. Aberline released him, with apologies that did nothing to restore the man's shattered reputation. The detective inspector felt the weight of political pressure from commissioners demanding results and media interference that compromised every avenue of investigation. Then, on September 27th, A letter arrived at the Central News Agency that would change everything. The correspondent signed himself Jack the Ripper, the first time that name appeared anywhere, and promised to continue his work with gleeful mockery of police efforts. Handwriting experts examined the red ink scrawl and declared it likely a hoax from someone seeking attention, but the newspapers ran with the name anyway, cementing it in public consciousness forever. George Lusk organized the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, recruiting local tradesmen to patrol the streets in groups after dark, armed with whistles and makeshift weapons. The Metropolitan Police increased official patrols and deployed plainclothes officers to blend into the crowds, watching for anything suspicious. Aberlane studied maps of the murder sites, noting the tight geographic cluster, the preference for early morning hours, the escalating violence. His experienced gut told him what his rational mind resisted. This was not finished. On September 29th, as fog rolled in thick from the river and gaslight struggled against the darkness, every detective in Whitechapel braced for what felt inevitable. Louis Diemschutz drove his pony cart into Dutefield's yard at 1 o'clock in the morning, returning to the International Working Men's Educational Club, where he served as steward. His horse shied suddenly at something lying in the darkness against the wall. Diemschutz climbed down and struck a match, revealing Elizabeth Stride with her throat cut deeply but her body otherwise unmolested. The killer had been interrupted, driven away by the sound of hooves and wheels. 45 minutes later, and 3/4 of a mile distant, a night watchman discovered Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. And this time the Ripper had completed his terrible work. Her face had been disfigured with deliberate cuts, her abdomen opened and intestines draped over her shoulder, her left kidney removed and taken away. This was the most savage mutilation yet, accomplished in complete silence within 15 minutes in a square patrolled by police. The two murders created immediate jurisdictional chaos because Stride fell under Metropolitan Police authority, while Eddowes lay within the City of London police domain. Detective Inspector James McWilliam took charge of the Eddowes investigation with territorial jealousy that hampered information sharing despite the obvious connection. At 10 minutes past 3, a constable discovered a piece of bloodied apron in a Goulston Street doorway, cut from the fabric Eddowes had worn. Above it on the black brick wall, someone had scrawled in white chalk a message about the Jewes being men who would not be blamed for nothing. Commissioner Charles Warren arrived before dawn and made the fateful decision to erase the message immediately, fearing it would spark anti-Semitic riots when the Jewish market traders arrived. Aberlane received word of the erasure and felt rage unlike anything in his career. The killer had left them handwriting evidence, a potential window into his mind, and Warren had destroyed it to preserve public order. The erased Goulston Street message haunted investigators for what it might have revealed about the killer's education, mental state, and perhaps even identity. The peculiar spelling of Jewes, the double negative construction, the very act of pausing to write after committing 2 murders suggested a mind both organized and contemptuous of authority. Eddowes' post-mortem confirmed that her left kidney had been removed with surgical precision, taken as some grotesque trophy. On October 16th, George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee received a small package at his home. Inside a cardboard box preserved in spirits sat half a human kidney, accompanied by a letter written in an uneducated hand. The writer claimed to have fried and ate the other half and found it very nice, signing the missive "From Hell." Medical experts examined the kidney and determined it had come from a woman of approximately 45 years suffering from Bright's disease, matching Eddowes' condition exactly. Aberlane began plotting the murder sites on a detailed map of Whitechapel, and a clear pattern emerged. All 5 confirmed attacks fell within a tight radius of roughly half a mile, centered on the heart of the district. The killer operated within a comfort zone, someone with intimate knowledge of the courts alleys, and escape routes that honeycomb the area. The suspect list expanded to include Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher with a history of mental instability, Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant showing signs of dangerous insanity, and Michael Ostrog, a Russian confidence trickster with violent tendencies. Police resources stretched to breaking as hundreds of witness statements accumulated and thousands of man-hours produced diminishing returns. Late one evening, Aberlin stood alone in the incident room, pinning colored threads between murder locations on his wall map, and saw a pattern that everyone else had missed entirely. October passed with agonizing slowness, and no further murders, though police maintained heightened patrols that left constables exhausted and nerves frayed. Detectives and doctors engaged in endless psychological theorizing about what manner of man could commit such acts, drawing on Victorian understanding of insanity, sexual deviance, and moral degeneracy that seemed woefully inadequate to explain the calculated horror they had witnessed. The victims themselves shared troubling commonalities when examined collectively. All 5 women ranged between 35 and 47 years old. All struggled with alcoholism. All lived in absolute destitution at the margins of society. Their final days followed similar patterns of desperation, moving between casual labor when available and prostitution when necessary, seeking the 4 pence required for a bed in a common lodging house or facing a night on the streets. The doss house culture defined their existence. Communal sleeping rooms with canvas beds separated by thin partitions where dozens of unfortunates crowded together for temporary shelter. The casual ward system at workhouses offered alternative refuge, but required splitting up families and submitting to harsh regulations that many found intolerable. Community response to the murders brought charity efforts and temporary housing initiatives for prostitutes, with social reformers like William Booth of the Salvation Army and Josephine Butler advocating for systemic change. But economic reality proved stronger than charitable impulse as women returned to the streets by necessity, driven by hunger and the endless need for that nightly 4 pence. False alarms multiplied as panicked citizens reported RIPPER sightings across the district, and hoax letters flooded police stations by the dozen. By November 8th, detectives began wondering whether the killer had stopped, died, been imprisoned for some other crime, or simply left London. That question would be answered within hours. Thomas Bowyer knocked on the door of 13 Miller's Court at 11:15 in the morning, sent by his employer to collect overdue rent from Mary Jane Kelly. Receiving no answer, he reached through the broken window pane and pulled aside the muslin curtain. What he saw sent him staggering backward in horror. The small single-room lodging contained a scene of butchery beyond anything witnessed in the previous murders. Mary Jane Kelly, just 25 years old and the youngest victim, had been mutilated beyond recognition on her own bed. Dr. Thomas Bond conducted the post-mortem and documented complete evisceration. The face flayed away entirely, breasts removed, organs extracted and arranged around the body. The killer had spent hours in methodical work, secure in the privacy of the locked room. Kelly's background differed from the other victims as she was younger, Irish, and claimed to have worked West End brothels before descending to Whitechapel. She had last been seen alive at 2 in the morning, and witness Mary Ann Cox reported hearing her singing A Violet from Mother's Grave until 1 o'clock. George Hutchinson came forward with a remarkably detailed account of seeing Kelly with a well-dressed gentleman around 2 in the morning. He described the man as wearing an astrakhan coat with a gold watch chain and sporting a dark mustache, features suggesting wealth and respectability. Police circulated a sketch based on Hutchinson's description, but the man was never identified. Dr. Bond compiled what would become the first criminal psychological profile in history, concluding that the subject would appear quiet and inoffensive in appearance, likely living alone, possibly working in a position requiring some skill. The profile offered little immediate help, but marked a revolution in investigative thinking. The question haunting every detective was simple and terrible. Why had the violence escalated to this extreme, and why would it stop here? Crime scene investigators found the fireplace in Kelly's room filled with burnt clothing remnants, ashes piled so high they had melted the spout, a tin kettle sitting above. The leading theory held that the killer had burned Kelly's clothes to provide light for his terrible work, as the single candle in the room would have proved insufficient. Close examination of the ash pile revealed fragments of women's clothing that did not match Kelly's known possessions, suggesting the killer had brought items specifically to fuel the fire. Thermal analysis indicated the fire had burned with unusual intensity, fed deliberately over time to maintain illumination throughout the hours-long mutilation. This murder differed fundamentally from the others with its indoor setting, extended time frame, and complete privacy, allowing the killer to indulge his darkest impulses without interruption or haste. The question haunting investigators became why stop after Kelly, and why escalate to this level of destruction? Cessation theories proliferated as detectives considered whether the killer had died, emigrated, been imprisoned for some other crime, or simply satisfied whatever final urge had driven him. Dr. Bond's November 10th report to Scotland Yard described the killer as likely middle-aged, physically strong, and respectably dressed. Someone who could move through society without arousing suspicion. Media coverage reached fever pitch with international newspapers from New York to Sydney running sensational accounts of the Whitechapel horrors. Public outrage focused on Commissioner Charles Warren, whose mishandling of the Goulston Street evidence had become symbolic of police failure. Warren resigned on November 9th, the same day as Kelly's murder, officially due to the graffito erasure, though broader incompetence sealed his fate. James Monroe assumed the commissioner role amid calls for wholesale reform. Aberlin sat alone reviewing files on all 5 canonical murders, studying the progression from Nichols to Kelly, and felt with absolute certainty that this was the finale. November and December passed without further murders, and police gradually reduced patrols, reallocating exhausted resources to other pressing matters across London. Aberline continued investigating with the tenacity of a man who had walked those blood-soaked crime scenes, but support diminished as superiors declared the case effectively closed. Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson and Chief Inspector Donald Swanson pursued the Aaron Kosminski theory with particular conviction. Kosminski was a Polish-Jewish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser and exhibited violent tendencies toward women, harboring paranoid delusions that voices commanded him to harm others. He was committed to Colney Hatch Asylum in March 1889, timing that matched the cessation of murders, but no physical evidence connected him to any of the crimes. Other suspects underwent intense investigation, including Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor who fled to the United States in November, and George Chapman, a Polish poisoner later hanged for murdering 3 women, though his method differed entirely. Montague Druitt emerged as another possibility when his body was pulled from the Thames in early December 1888, stones weighing down his pockets in apparent suicide. The private MacNaughton memo, written in 1894, would name Druitt as the likely Ripper, describing him as a barrister from a good family who drowned himself shortly after the Kelly murder. The theory contained a fatal flaw, as records proved Druitt was in Bournemouth visiting family during the Chapman murder, providing an ironclad alibi. By 1889, the case remained technically open, but sat effectively inactive, another unsolved file among thousands. The physical evidence, witness statements, suspect lists, and autopsy reports were boxed carefully and stored in Scotland Yard basement archives where they would gather dust for decades, waiting for someone to see what the original investigators had missed. In 2006, the National Archives released previously restricted RIPPER files to public access, and researchers descended upon the documents with fresh eyes and modern analytical tools. One investigator noticed an anomaly buried in witness statements that Victorian detectives had documented but never properly synthesized. 3 separate witnesses on different nights described the same distinctive detail about men seen with victims moments before their deaths. Police Constable William Smith reported seeing a man with Elizabeth Stride at midnight on September 30th, wearing a dark coat and peaked cap. Joseph Lewend described a man with Catherine Eddowes at 1 that same morning, also noting a peaked cap. George Hutchinson's detailed account of the man with Mary Jane Kelly at 2 on November 9th again mentioned a Naval-style peaked cap among other features. Victorian London teemed with men wearing similar caps, and period investigators dismissed the detail as meaningless coincidence given how common such headwear was among working men. But modern analysis revealed something crucial. The specific descriptions matched Royal Navy petty officer uniform caps rather than generic civilian headwear, a distinction lost on detectives unfamiliar with naval dress codes. Cross-referencing Goulston Street, where the bloodied apron was found, showed it lay on a direct route from Whitechapel to the London docks. A new theory emerged that the killer might have been a sailor with regular shore leave access rather than a permanent Whitechapel resident. Returning to Victorian timeline records showed why police missed this connection entirely. Aberlin's notes mentioned the cap detail, but focused investigative energy on facial features and build instead. The prevailing 1888 theory assumed the killer must be a local resident, given his intimate knowledge of the neighborhood's courts and alleys. The sailor theory was briefly considered, then dismissed, because murders occurred over months, leading investigators to assume only a permanent resident could maintain such a prolonged campaign. Modern researchers accessed Royal Navy records and merchant marine logs preserved in the National Archives, cross-referencing ship movements during September through November 1888 with the murder chronology. They identified vessels docked in London with crew given shore leave coinciding with the killing dates. The critical discovery came with HMS Northumberland, a battleship that arrived in London docks on August 28th and remained until September 3rd. The crew received shore leave on September 1st and 2nd, bracketing the August 31st Nichols murder perfectly. The ship departed September 3rd, but returned September 7th with shore leave granted September 8th, the exact date Annie Chapman was killed. The pattern continued as researchers traced ship movements that aligned disturbingly well with subsequent murder dates. However, HMS Northumberland carried a crew roster of over 400 men, making individual identification nearly impossible without additional filters. Investigators narrowed the search to petty officers with medical training, specifically sick berth attendants, who would possess the anatomical knowledge Dr. Phillips and Dr. Bond had identified as crucial. An alternate theory emerged around Charles Allen Lechmere, the carter who discovered Nichols' body and gave police a false name during initial questioning. Some researchers argued Lechmere himself was the killer, using his discovery of the body as cover. But Lechmere worked as a carter transporting goods, not a sailor, and nothing in his background suggested naval connection or the distinctive Cap 3 witnesses described. Returning to naval records, researchers sought a petty officer with documented anatomical knowledge, shore leave access, and physical description matching witness accounts. After weeks of painstaking cross-referencing between crew rosters, leave logs, and service records, one name emerged with disturbing connections that sent investigators down an entirely unexpected path. The name that emerged from the investigation was not a sailor at all, but James Kelly, a real historical figure whose story intersected with the RIPPER timeline in troubling ways. Born in Liverpool in 1860, Kelly had trained as an upholstery apprentice, learning precision cutting techniques for fabric and leather that gave him intimate knowledge of patterns and anatomical forms. In 1883, he murdered his wife Sarah with a knife in their London home, was ruled criminally insane, and committed to Broadmoor Asylum for the criminally insane. In January 1888, Kelly escaped from Broadmoor and vanished completely. Scotland Yard circulated his description and searched for him throughout 1888 and 1889 without success. His upholstery background provided exactly the anatomical knowledge doctors noted in the RIPPER murders, the ability to make precise cuts and understand underlying structures. Kelly's description matched witness accounts remarkably well. 5 feet 8 inches tall, dark mustache, quiet demeanor that allowed him to move through crowds unnoticed. The crucial problem was that no evidence placed Kelly in London during the actual murders. Alternative theories suggested he emigrated to America immediately after his escape. However, re-examining Broadmoor escape records revealed Kelly left behind a cryptic note stating he would return when he had found what he sought. Psychological assessments from his asylum tenure showed delusional thinking fixated on women who had betrayed him. His wife Sarah had worked as a prostitute before their marriage, and Kelly killed her during a psychotic episode, stabbing her repeatedly in a frenzy. The theory emerged that Kelly was hunting surrogates for his dead wife, reenacting her murder compulsively with women who reminded him of what she had been. Cross-referencing Kelly's few known locations with murder dates produced circumstantial evidence that formed a compelling pattern, suggesting he might have been the invisible predator police never caught. The problem remained that James Kelly was an upholsterer, not a sailor, yet 3 witnesses specifically described naval headwear. Re-examining the witness descriptions revealed crucial nuances between generic peaked caps and naval caps. Victorian fashion included peaked caps worn commonly by tradesmen, carters, and workers across all industries. However, the 3 witnesses noted details beyond simple peaked design, specifically mentioning dark navy cloth and, in one account, anchor buttons that marked official naval issue rather than civilian imitation. Research into Kelly's escape route proved illuminating. He fled Broadmoor in Berkshire, but had been born and trained in Liverpool, one of Britain's major port cities where maritime culture permeated working-class life. The theory emerged that Kelly worked the docks after his escape, acquiring authentic sailors' clothing as both disguise and practical garment. Liverpool to London railway connections allowed easy travel, and Kelly could have moved between cities following work opportunities. Merchant marine records revealed that casual laborers were hired regularly without formal documentation, paid in cash for short voyages or dock work with no questions asked about backgrounds. Kelly could have worked intermittent ship voyages explaining the gaps between murders when he seemed to vanish from Whitechapel entirely. Examining Kelly's asylum records showed his escape had been planned meticulously over months, demonstrating intelligence and patience. Dr. Orange's notes from Broadmoor specifically stated that the patient exhibits cunning and deception, maintaining a facade of compliance while secretly preparing his departure. Kelly was capable of evading police while maintaining a dual identity, perhaps working as casual dock laborer under assumed names. Returning to HMS Northumberland records, researchers attempted to cross-check casual labor hires during the ship's London visits. The records proved incomplete, as was common for the era, but the ship remained in port during critical dates when murders occurred, and Kelly remained a ghost in the system, completely invisible to authorities. Returning to the September 30th Eddowes murder, researchers reanalyzed the bloodied apron piece found 55 minutes after the body was discovered at 3 in the morning. Police Constable Alfred Long found the apron fragment in a Goulston Street doorway at Wentworth Model Dwellings, with the chalk message above it. Commissioner Warren's controversial erasure had been justified by fears of anti-Semitic riots, but re-examining the message wording revealed curious details. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing" contained a double negative, creating confusing syntax that might have been intentional misdirection rather than poor grammar. A new theory emerged that the killer deliberately placed the apron near a Jewish neighborhood to manipulate the investigation. Wentworth buildings housed predominantly Jewish immigrants, making it the perfect location to plant evidence that would focus suspicion on that community. Mapping the killer's route from Mitre Square to Goulston Street showed movement in a northeast direction, contradicting the logical southeast route toward Whitechapel and the docks where he presumably sought refuge. This detour made no sense unless the killer deliberately doubled back to leave a false trail, drawing police attention away from his actual destination. Modern handwriting experts examined the only photographic record of the Jew's message preserved in police sketches and compared it to the "Dear Boss" and "From Hell" letters. Analysis showed inconsistent hand formation, suggesting different authors for each communication, meaning the graffito likely came from the killer himself, while the letters were hoaxes. But the message placement proved strategically brilliant, drawing massive police resources into investigating the Jewish community, while the actual killer slipped away toward the docks unnoticed. The apron had not been discarded carelessly during flight, but planted as deliberate evidence to misdirect the investigation away from his true escape route and identity. George Hutchinson provided the most detailed witness account in the entire investigation, approaching police on November 12th to report seeing Mary Jane Kelly with a well-dressed gentleman at 2 in the morning on November 9th. His description was extraordinarily specific. A man aged 34 to 35, 5 feet 6 inches tall, heavy dark mustache, expensive dark coat with astrakhan collar, gold watch chain, horseshoe tie pin, and what Hutchinson termed a Jewish appearance. Hutchinson claimed he followed the pair to Miller's Court out of curiosity and watched the entrance for 45 minutes before leaving, because nothing happened. Police initially accepted his testimony and circulated sketches based on his description, then quietly dismissed it without public explanation. The dismissal stemmed from timeline problems, as witness Mary Ann Cox reported hearing Kelly singing until 1 in the morning, creating conflicts with Hutchinson's 2 o'clock sighting. Modern analysis suggests Hutchinson might have fabricated the entire story, seeking reward money offered by newspapers and vigilance committees. Alternatively, a darker theory proposes Hutchinson was the killer himself, inserting himself into the investigation to control the narrative and misdirect suspicion. Comparing Hutchinson's detailed description to James Kelly's known appearance revealed intriguing matches. Kelly stood 5 feet 8 inches tall rather than 5'6", but close enough for witness error, possessed the same dark mustache, and at age 28 could pass for mid-30s. Kelly's upholstery work would have provided income for quality clothing, allowing him to appear respectable rather than like a common laborer. Most tellingly, Hutchinson vanished after giving his statement and was never seen again by police despite their attempts to re-interview him. The theory emerged that Hutchinson was an alias used by Kelly, who disappeared once police scrutiny became uncomfortable. If Hutchinson was indeed the killer, he had achieved perfect control over the narrative by describing himself as a witness to an invented suspect. December 1888 arrived, and the murders ceased abruptly after Mary Jane Kelly with no confirmed Ripper killings after November 9th. Police theories attempted to explain the sudden cessation, suggesting the killer had died, been imprisoned for other crimes, or left the country entirely. The historical record of James Kelly showed he vanished completely in 1888 and then reappeared under extraordinary circumstances 39 years later. In February 1927, James Kelly walked through the gates of Broadmoor Asylum and surrendered himself to stunned officials. He claimed to have spent the intervening decades traveling through France and America, offering this simple explanation as if it justified 4 decades of freedom. Asylum staff could barely comprehend that the elderly man before them, now 67 years old, was the same patient who had escaped in January 1888. Kelly's only statement was that he had traveled the world and now wished to rest, providing no specific details about his whereabouts during 1888 or any subsequent year. He died in Broadmoor in 1929, taking whatever secrets he possessed to his grave. Researchers investigating Kelly's American period faced immediate obstacles, as arrival records and Ellis Island logs contained thousands of men named James Kelly, making positive identification nearly impossible. However, cross-referencing with violent crimes produced a disturbing discovery. In New York, on April 24, 1891, a prostitute named Carrie Brown, known as Old Shakespeare, was murdered in the East River Hotel. Her throat had been slashed, and her abdomen mutilated with organs removed, bearing striking similarities to the RIPPER methodology. Police arrested an Algerian immigrant who was later released when evidence proved insufficient, and the murder was never solved. The timeline from 1888, London to 1891 New York represented plausible emigration, and Kelly's shadow seemed to stretch across the Atlantic, suggesting his campaign of terror may have continued far from Whitechapel's fog-shrouded alleys. On February 12, 1927, James Kelly appeared at the gates of Broadmoor Asylum and requested readmittance, confronting staff who recognized him from records dating back 44 years. Medical examination revealed an aged and frail man who nonetheless appeared remarkably lucid for someone who had spent decades as a fugitive. The attending physician reported that Kelly showed no signs of violent tendency and appeared curiously at peace with himself and his circumstances. When questioned about his escape, Kelly offered only the cryptic statement that he needed to see the world. When pressed about 1888 specifically, he claimed he had been many places but remembered little, suggesting either genuine memory loss or deliberate evasion. Psychological assessment noted possible dementia given his age, but staff members observed strange clarity in Kelly's eyes when discussing his past, as though he remembered far more than he admitted. The concept emerged that serial killers often surrender when their compulsion fades, much like Dennis Rader, who turned himself in during 2005 after 31 years, unable to resist the urge to claim credit for his crimes. Kelly, at 67, had aged beyond physical capacity for violence, his hands trembling and body weakened by time. The theory developed that Kelly returned because he had achieved whatever he sought, fulfilling the promise in his 1888 Broadmoor note, stating he would return when he found what he sought. What had he sought through those years? Revenge against women who reminded him of his wife? Control over life and death? Infamy that would echo through history? By returning voluntarily, Kelly ensured he would never truly be caught, as any statute of limitations had long passed. He died anonymous in 1929, his official record listing him simply as an escaped asylum patient. Authorities never questioned him about the RIPPER murders specifically, and Kelly's last recorded words before his death were hauntingly simple: "I have seen enough." The circumstantial case for James Kelly as Jack the Ripper assembled itself through a constellation of interconnected evidence points. His anatomical knowledge derived from upholstery work requiring precision cutting of leather and fabric along specific patterns that mimicked underlying structures. His prior violence demonstrated capacity, as he had murdered his wife Sarah with a knife using methodology eerily similar to the RIPPER attacks, with multiple stab wounds and slashing cuts. The timing proved remarkable, as Kelly escaped Broadmoor in January 1888, and the murders began that August, a 7-month gap, allowing him to establish himself in London. The cessation matched perfectly as murders stopped in November 1888, and Kelly vanished without trace from any records. Witness descriptions matched Kelly's physical appearance, including height, dark mustache, and quiet demeanor that allowed him to blend into crowds. Dr. Bond's psychological profile, describing a quiet, inoffensive-appearing man of middle age, matched Kelly's asylum records, noting his cunning and deceptive capabilities. Geographical access existed through Liverpool to London railway connections, and possible dock work, providing both income and cover identity. His motive stemmed from delusional hatred of prostitutes rooted in his wife's background, projecting his rage onto surrogate victims. Intelligence showed in his meticulously planned Broadmoor escape, demonstrating patience and strategic thinking. The historical endpoint saw him surrender in 1927 and die in 1929 without confession, taking secrets to his grave. Counter-arguments acknowledged that no direct physical evidence placed Kelly at any murder scene, and the naval cap description could represent coincidence or deliberate red herring. The Hutchinson identification remained uncertain, and other suspects like Kosminski and Druitt had attracted significant police attention. However, Kosminski was not committed to asylum until 1891, 3 years after murders ceased, weakening that theory considerably. Druitt possessed verified alibi for the Chapman murder, placing him in Bournemouth that day, effectively exonerating him. Modern criminal profiling techniques applied to the case showed Kelly fit behavioral patterns perfectly as an organized offender with prior violence, sexual dysfunction, and psychological breaks triggered by specific stressors. While beyond reasonable doubt remained impossible given the passage of time, Kelly emerged as the strongest suspect. The 1888 policing challenges that allowed Kelly to evade capture stemmed from systemic limitations, including no national database to cross-reference criminals and no fingerprinting technology to link suspects to crime scenes. Kelly's asylum escape had been duly reported to Metropolitan Police Headquarters, but Broadmoor sat in Berkshire, while Metropolitan Police jurisdiction covered only London, creating communication gaps between regional forces. Kelly's escape was not prioritized, as he was considered low risk, given that he simply walked out rather than staging a violent breakout, and authorities assumed he would return voluntarily or be picked up for vagrancy. Police investigators focused overwhelmingly on Whitechapel locals, operating under the assumption that only someone intimately familiar with the district could navigate its labyrinth successfully. Aberline's geographic profiling reinforced this belief, as the tight cluster of murders suggested deep local knowledge. However, Kelly could have scouted the area during August before the first murder, and Whitechapel's maze of courts and alleys could be learned by any observant stranger within days of concentrated exploration. Witness statements led police to seek suspects with local Cockney accents, but Kelly's Liverpool origins gave him a regional accent that, while not Cockney, was also not foreign, and multiple witnesses noted his quiet voice that made specific accent identification difficult. Class assumptions pervaded the investigation, as police expected a madman with wild appearance and deranged behavior. Yet Kelly's respectable dress, funded by upholstery trade earnings, allowed him to blend seamlessly into crowds as just another working man. Victorian criminal anthropology, championed by Cesare Lombroso, taught that criminals possessed physical signs of degeneracy, including asymmetrical features, heavy brows, and brutish appearances. Police sought these markers, while Kelly appeared completely normal with regular features and calm demeanor. Kelly remained invisible because he contradicted every assumption investigators held about who and what Jack the Ripper must be. The narrative must shift perspective because this remains fundamentally the story of 5 women, not one man, 5 lives reduced to footnotes in the mythology of their killer. Mary Ann Nichols was born in 1845 and married William Nichols in 1864, bearing 5 children before separation in 1880, when alcoholism destroyed the fragile bonds holding the family together. Her final years passed in grinding cycles between workhouse wards and common lodging houses, desperate survival measured in pennies and pints. Her last words to a friend captured tragic optimism. She would soon get her DOS money, and look at what a jolly bonnet she had acquired. Annie Chapman was born Eliza Ann Smith in 1841 and married John Chapman in 1869, bringing 2 children to adulthood, though one died young. When her husband died in 1886, his modest pension stopped, and she descended into poverty that forced her to sell flowers, crochet work, and finally her body simply to survive each day. Elizabeth Stride was born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in Sweden in 1843, immigrating to London in 1866, where she married John Stride 3 years later. Widowed when her husband drowned, she worked as a charwoman and became known in the district as Long Liz for her height, recognizable by her Swedish accent, and as a regular at the local coffee shop. Catherine Eddowes was born in 1842 and lived in common-law marriage with Thomas Conway, bearing 3 children before the relationship dissolved under the weight of mutual alcoholism. She found a new partner in John Kelly, not the suspect but a kind man who pawned his boots the day before her death, trying to raise money. She had been released from a police cell for drunk and disorderly conduct just 90 minutes before her murder. Mary Jane Kelly was born around 1863 in Ireland under a name that may itself have been false, claiming to have worked West End brothels before marrying young to a man killed in a mining accident. She moved to Whitechapel in 1884, the youngest and most mysterious victim, killed on the very day her rent collector arrived to demand arrears. These were daughters, mothers, and sisters, not just victims. The Ripper case's impact on policing exposed the desperate need for centralized records and interjurisdictional communication, leading directly to creation of the Fingerprint Bureau in 1901, and significant criminal investigation department improvements in following decades. This became the first case with extensive media coverage that shaped the modern concept of the serial killer, though that specific term would not be coined until the 1970s, when FBI profilers began studying patterns of repetitive murder. The Ripper served as the prototype for understanding predatory criminals who kill strangers for psychological gratification rather than material gain. Modern investigations have attempted to solve the case using contemporary forensic techniques with mixed results. In 2014, day analysis of a shawl allegedly taken from the Eddowes crime scene claimed to match descendants of Aaron Kosminski, but the scientific community disputed findings due to broken chain of custody and likely contamination over 126 years. A 2019 study reanalyzed all surviving Ripper letters, concluding that none could be definitively attributed to the actual killer, confirming long-held suspicions that most were hoaxes from attention seekers. Geographic profiling software applying Rosmo's algorithm to the murder sites in 2002 suggested the killer likely lived within the zone bounded by the crimes, supporting the local resident theory. However, this did not exclude a transient suspect using temporary lodging within that area, as Kelly might have done working docks intermittently. Psychological autopsy of Kelly's 1927 surrender, analyzed by modern forensic psychologists, found his behavior consistent with aging serial killers seeking closure when compulsion fades. Comparisons to other cases like BTK and the Golden State Killer, caught via genealogical DNA, demonstrated how modern techniques could theoretically solve the Ripper murders if physical evidence existed in viable condition. Unfortunately, DNA degradation after 130 years makes recovery of usable samples extremely unlikely from any surviving artifacts. The case remains officially unsolved in Metropolitan Police records, but among the dozens of suspects proposed over 13 decades, James Kelly's shadow looms largest. The central question returns with clarity stripped of myth and sensation. Who was Jack the Ripper? Not a ghost or demon or superhuman monster, but simply a man. And perhaps that man was James Kelly, upholsterer, husband, murderer, asylum patient, and world traveler. A man who killed his wife in 1883, escaped justice through cunning, and perhaps killed 5 more women across a bloody autumn before vanishing into history. A man who understood that anonymity served as his greatest weapon in an age before fingerprints, DNA, or centralized criminal databases. Victorian London's chaos provided perfect camouflage for an invisible predator moving through crowds of strangers where no one knew their neighbors, and transients defined existence. The pattern buried in archives for over a century revealed itself. 3 witnesses describing the same naval cap, maritime connections to Liverpool and London docks, timing that aligned with shore leave and casual labor. Kelly's escape from Broadmoor in January 1888. The murder spree beginning in August. The sudden cessation in November. His disappearance across decades, and his inexplicable return in 1927 formed a timeline that defied coincidence. The psychology matched perfectly. Rage against women rooted in his wife's prostitution. Need for absolute control expressed through methodical mutilation. Surgical precision learned through upholstery trade. The ending proved anticlimactic, as Kelly died peacefully in bed in 1929. Never charged, never confessed, taking whatever truth he possessed into the grave. If Kelly was indeed the Ripper, he won completely, escaping justice for 41 years and returning only when age and time rendered him legally and physically untouchable. The title's promise stands delivered as Kelly emerges unmasked through forgotten evidence, yet definitive proof remains forever beyond reach exactly as he intended. The greater tragedy lies in how 5 women were erased from history, reduced eternally to Ripper victims, rather than remembered for their lives, struggles, and fundamental humanity, which matters infinitely more than their killer's identity. The final image settles over Broadmoor Asylum in 1929, where Kelly's grave marker stands simple and unremarkable among hundreds of others. Somewhere in that silent earth lies the answer to history's greatest mystery. But perhaps some answers are meant to haunt us rather than satisfy us. Jack the Ripper was never caught because he never truly left. He simply walked back into the shadows and waited until the world stopped looking.